Um, hey guys, this is Grim Perspectives, I'm Grim. Today, we're gonna do another section of Grim Advice, which means we're gonna talk about something that I think is important to both players and game masters of pen and paper campaigns. What we are gonna talk about today is character death. And I think it's important to talk about it. Let's start with a simple question. What is the problem with character death? That question might sound silly or even absurd to you, but I put it to you that it isn't. That's a really important question because we tend to view character death as the worst thing that can happen to a character and his player in a campaign. And I really would like to ask you the question and discuss that a bit further and ask if it really is. Because you might have heard of a little known thing, a little known part of fiction known as A Song of Ice and Fire or the Game of Thrones. It's not little known, it's a pop culture phenomenon. And why is it a pop culture phenomenon? Well, for one, because it broke with a tradition that has been prevalent in pop culture for the last few decades at least. And that is that we, as viewers of a series or as readers of a novel, could be pretty certain that the characters we cared about lived through the tale. Character death didn't happen to important characters. Important characters had plot armor. They were important to the plot, so they were not gonna die. Yeah. And when the Song of Ice and Fire came along, we realized one thing. That taking that security from us, the security that our character would live, or beloved characters would live, it gave us something else. It gave us a really impactful story. It really made everything seem vivid and dangerous, and we really wanted to know what will happen next. We couldn't just doze off for half an hour, because if you did, then 200 pages afterwards, one of the characters you liked might be dead. And you didn't really notice how that happened. Everything became important because the stakes were higher. Okay. So, Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire broke with tradition. But in doing so, it went back in line with a different tradition. Traditions like the great plays like Shakespeare, Hamlet, the great tragedies, where you could only be certain that a Shakespearean tragedy is over when everyone's dead. And there are other examples of modern pop culture that clearly take a leaf from Shakespeare's books, like Sons of Anarchy or stuff like that, which are really high impact, interesting stories, character-driven stories. And they only work because there are really high stakes involved. The lives of the characters we hold dear. And you might argue that a pen and paper character is just different. They work different. They are my method of influencing the action. And it's important. And I don't want them to die. So, are they really different? I would like to say they are not. Because let's take a classic fantasy, archetypical fantasy pen paper campaign, Dungeons and Dragons. Your character is an adventurer. Have you thought about what this means? He has chosen a life of trial, of violence, and of grave danger over everything else he could have done. He might have been a farmer, a shoemaker, whatever. No, he chose a life of danger. And that choice is important. And that choice only is a hard choice if there's really danger involved. If the danger of losing friends, your physical corporal integrity, or your life is not there, then what's that decision worth? What are you really sacrificing? What is your character sacrificing? What's the impact of his story? The impact becomes pretty negligible if there is no stake in, no high stakes involved. So I sometimes get asked the question, because I GM a lot, how do I avoid character death? What can I do so my character doesn't die? And I think that is the wrong question. I think the answer to the question how to avoid character death is don't. At least not at all costs. Because you do not want to avoid all character death. That's not your goal. And okay, let's take a step back and look at character death, because there are clearly different types. Let's take a step back. So, there might be a heroic death for your character. A heroic death is when your character sacrifices himself for the greater good. Your character chooses to do something and it turns out to be exactly the right thing. He might not live through it, but he's going out in a blaze of glory. His story will be sung for all eternity, or at least as far as people remember him. And is that something we want to avoid? No. I would say that's something really cool that more pen paper campaigns should have. On the same page, it's something that's not really easy to plan for or something. That's not that easy to do, but okay, it's something we at least we don't want to avoid it, right? So what do we want to avoid? Well, what character death is there? There might be tragic character death. What is tragic character death? Well, go back to the Greeks, and the tragic character death in Greek tragedies is when a character dies not because it's important, but because it is inevitable, because of the weaknesses of the character or the downside of his strength, which is essentially the same thing. So your character might be a very loyal guy, and he might something that's really important to the campaign. The greater good would be served if he lived to fight another day, took that thing and brought it somewhere else. But he's a loyal guy, and a friend is in grave danger. And instead of doing the right thing, living to fight another day, getting that important MacGuffin somewhere, he goes back, tries to save that comrade, that friend, and he dies. And that's not even a good thing. It's not even relevant. It's not even furthering the greater good. Is that a death we want to avoid? I would say not even this death is one we would like to avoid, because while it is a bittersweet death, we made our character with all those flaws, and dying for what you believe in, even if it isn't totally intelligent thing to believe in, or maybe it's from metagaming point of view, it's not that helpful, or maybe from a campaign standpoint it's not that helpful. But going down for what you believe in is an ending I would not like to avoid for my character. Depending on the character, that's an ending I would like my character to have. So, what do we actually want to avoid? What we want to avoid is random character death, accidental character death. And let's take a closer look at that, because that is really important. So, how do we avoid accidental character death? Well, for one, we want to avoid pointless danger. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? Well, probably all of you have played pen and paper campaigns and know that sometimes it's not that easy. Because, for one, you don't always know when a situation is dangerous. Because your game master certainly has an idea if a situation is dangerous, but either he doesn't really want to tell you because he's got something set up for you, or he might be ambivalent or might even want you to know that the situation is dangerous and that you are in fact facing pointless danger, or facing danger at least. But there might be a problem in the communication. You might not, you are a player. You aren't in the room your character is in. You do not live his life, see through his eyes. You might not realize that the situation is dangerous for the character. So I would advise that you at least remember that you can ask questions like the following. As how dangerous does my character judge the situation? And that might seem a strange question to ask, but please remember, we ask questions like that of our game masters all the time, because essentially every knowledge skill works that way. Most skills work that way. There are some things our characters can do and know that we as players do not know or can do. I can play a magician who knows a lot of stuff about arcane magic that I as a player don't know. Obvious, right? So if my character is in a situation, he has a much better understanding of it, at least most of the time maybe, than I as his player does. So asking my game master if my character judges the situation as dangerous is a legitimate question. And the game master might say, well, we'll make a check like notice or something, or intelligence or whatever, but he might give you a clue and it might help you avoid danger that is only a result of miscommunication between you and your game master. The second problem with avoiding pointless danger is when is danger pointless, because we just discussed that we do not necessarily want to avoid all character death. We want to avoid accidental or random character death. So when is danger pointless? Well, ask yourself the following two questions. Is it worth risking the death of my character to me? Answered from the perspective of the player. And is it worth risking his or her life for the character? That one's answered from the perspective of the character. And you might end up with different answers to those two questions. Like, if you come up with both answers are no, essentially. So it's neither worth risking the death of your character to you as the player, neither to you nor the character. So, yeah, that's pretty pointless danger, right? You need to avoid that. That's a random character death waiting to happen. It will prove nothing. What else can happen? Well, you might end up answering both questions with yes. It's worth risking your character to you as the player, and your character would say, yeah, it's worth his life as well. That is a classic example of a possible heroic character death. And that's something you do not want to avoid. If you're feeling up to it as the player, go for it. Go all in. Give it your all. Go out in a blaze of glory. It will be a night to remember. Do it. You might end up answering the first question, with no, but the second with yes. So, from your perspective, you are the player. You want to play your character through the campaign. You've made a concept for him. You like him. So you want to continue playing him It's not worth risking the death of your character to you, essentially, but your character might say different. Your character might be that loyal guy who wants to save his friend, or that curious guy who wants to know what's behind it. And that is a possible tragic character death. And that's a judgment call. I can tell you what to do. If you are feeling up for it and feeling like a risk taker today, you can take the risk and go in. But, well, you can choose otherwise. I won't judge you on that. But it might be a worthwhile experience for you as a player. And, step back. So far, this video was pretty generic and applicable to more or less all pen paper games. But there are settings like Savage Worlds who will give you benefits for choosing to risk your character, not essentially because it's in your best interest as a player, but because your character might want to do so, because of his flaws, because of his strengths, because of his beliefs. In Savage Worlds, that's called a hindrance. And you get bennies, you get free rerolls of trait rolls, die rolls, more toughness for your character. Something that essentially means that you can survive more and survive longer as your character, if you've chosen the right hindrances. So, if your character is that loyal, stubborn guy, but there comes a time when you think, I as a player, I would really like to know what's going on there, and you send him in, but it's not really in keeping with your character, and your character can't that. Then you're risking your life, and it's not really in the interest of your character, and your GM might decide you don't get the benny for that. Might even make it even harder to survive that encounter. So what I'd advise is choose fitting hindrances for your characters. And a good way of finding out if those hindrances are fitting is to ask yourself, what would my character die for? Because essentially you might. It's a hindrance, it's something that is a flaw, maybe even a fatal flaw of your character. You might die for that. So the question, what would your character die for, is one you should ask yourself in character creation. And you might want to talk about the results of that question to your game master, because it's important that he knows what you're thinking about your character, so he can be aware and can essentially reward you for your action with those bennies. And just because I like Hamilton, if you stand for nothing but, what will you fall for? There are 3 things I would like you to take away from this. First, embrace character death. By that I don't mean that you should be rushing headlong into danger, but that you should accept that character death is a possibility in your game, because it makes the experience of the game much more interesting. But avoid unnecessary danger. And if that still seems like contradicting the first point, then I didn't make myself too clear, because that's 2 parts of the same coin. The question essentially is, what will your character die for? And that question includes 2 parts. What won't your character die for? And therefore it is unnecessary danger, needless, pointless danger to him. And what will your character die for? Which is a death he would embrace. And the third thing is more or less, it's a bit Savage World specific, but choose fitting hindrances for your character. Because in Savage Worlds they tie in that really beautiful mechanic of hindrances and bennies. And while we can maybe as players accept tragic character death, it might be difficult for us to make that decision. But knowing that possible tragic character death is recognize that you made that risk, made that choice to play your character's flaws is rewarded and recognized by your game master and your fellow players is a big deal. So it's important to choose fitting hindrances to what you want to play and talk about them with your game master. Talking about what your character would die for with your game master is something I can only recommend regardless of whether you play Savage Worlds or not. Okay, that's more or less what I wanted to say to you for today. But as always, if you like this video, like. If you want to keep up to date about what we're doing next, I really want to make a video talking about how to avoid accidental character death, but from a more mechanic point of view, Savage Worlds wise. What do you need to do to avoid that accidental character death? No one wants that. What do you do to avoid it? I really want to make that video. If you want to see it, hit subscribe. And the third thing, if you know someone who might be interested in what we're doing here, then tell him. Send him a link. If you know someone in one of your pen and paper sessions who either died a heroic character death, a tragic or a random one, you might want to send him that with a little smiley, and just so he knows you still think about that and that it made a difference in your experience of the game. Until then, well, the next time we're gonna do something a bit different, but until then, create something scary and wonderful. Don't hesitate to play for those big stakes. Create something truly wonderful in your campaigns and your games. Until then, Grim out.